So what I'll say just while Andrew's finding the slides is that it was the Irish Heart Foundation who got me going in this. And we thought it was going to be so easy. I said to them, yeah, sure, that's digital. All the data are available. We'll be able to find out exactly how children are exposed. And of course, what that put us on was a journey of discovery that...
You're okay now, your screen is sharing.
Thank you. That we're dealing with, yeah, thanks, Andrew. If you just go into slide 2, please, that would be fantastic. Thank you. That we're dealing with black boxes. So we're looking at platforms who don't share their data. So they have very extensive data on all of us in all domains of our lives, not just the marketing that we engage with and what children are served, but they don't share. And, you know, it's a fundamental sort of power inequality that we've allowed to evolve in society. We're seeing its impact in politics now, but it also affects children's lives in many, many ways, including through marketing and the ways that their thoughts and feelings and behaviors are being shaped, and in ways that we as societies, as parents, have no control over unless we manage to persuade regulators to say enough is enough. So that's my spiel. You can see there on the left of the slide, there's a list of the brands which in 2016 we identified as having, as Facebook saying, had the greatest reach among 13 to 14-year-olds in Ireland. So that list, as you can see, is made up of a mix of kind of international and, you know, favourite Irish brands. If we see Tato at number 3, Eddie Rockets down at number 10, Supermax and Abracadabra down at 16. So this was drawn from a list of 117 really high-selling brands which have a presence in social media. And as you can see from that list, there's not a lot of healthy food in there. So if we think about what is the greatest extent of what children are being exposed to, this is an indication of what it is. Let's go to the next slide. So the assumptions when we speak with parents and teens on this subject and engage with regulators and industry, the assumptions tend to be that particularly teens have got the capacity to see this ad, to know what it is, to ignore it when they choose to, and if they see it and notice it, to activate their advertising literacy, because of course by the time people are in their teens, they know what an ad is and what's going on with it. As Diane was explaining so clearly earlier on, you know, they're bringing the knowledge to her about how this ad is constructed. So all that rational thinking is in action. And I'm really pleased that Franz is going to talk to us later about advertising literacy and what we can or cannot hope that it can do. All right, next slide. So what did we want to know? We wanted to know how are teens responding to these ads in social media. Next slide. And if you want to have a look at what we found, you can, this is an open access article of a study that we carried out across a couple of years at UCD with my colleague Brendan Rooney there in the School of Psychology. And Emma Boyland at Liverpool joined us as well. And with a couple of master's students, so Gráinne Murphy and Ciara Corcoran there were our master's students who worked on this study to identify adolescents' responses to 3 kinds of advertising on a social media platform. So next slide. So what did we do? We created profiles using teen names that we took from CSO so that they would kind of resonate with young people of that age, teen-related content, sort of memes and various things. We had teens review the content. They told us we didn't have nearly enough exclamation marks in the posts that we'd created, and various ways in which we hadn't set ourselves young enough yet. So we attended to all of that. And then we integrated ads, which were designed to be for unhealthy, healthy, and non-food items that we thought would be popular and appealing to young people. And we mixed the ads up in a 3x3 design to be from celebrities, brands, and peers. So we worked with teens in Ennis and in Dublin, age 13 to 17 years, and you can see the spread across the 2 studies that we did there. All right, next slide, please, Andrew. Thank you. And here are just a few examples of the ways that we set these up in terms of creating content that might be sort of reasonably mimic stuff that would come through their social media feeds or others, or those of their peers. We also made them to look more male and more female in terms of the content that was there, just because the research tells us that people skew quite heavily to gender-specific content and the people and celebrities that they follow. All right, next slide. Okay, so 3 sets of things that we measured. And I'll just summarize very briefly what we did and what we found. So for eye tracking, we looked to see how often they looked at the ads and also how long they looked at them. And for how often they looked at the ads for these 3 different types of products, there was no difference. So teens were equally interested statistically in unhealthy non-food and healthy food ads. But in terms of how long they looked at them, we found that they looked longer at non-food ads and at unhealthy food ads statistically than they did at healthier food ads. And you can see, looking at these bars, that there's relatively little difference in all of these, but these are statistically significant differences. And what we need to bear in mind is the extent of exposure. If you think across a year or a few years, what happens is that the preponderance of advertising starts to add up over time. Next slide. So those were measures of attention. Then we came to measures of how did they respond in terms of their responses to these peers who we had made up, and the social and network effects that would create. So first of all, they were significantly more favorable about peers when they had unhealthy food in their social media feeds than when they had these popular non-food items and healthier food items. And they also critically said that they were much more likely to share unhealthy food items and those non-food items than any healthy food items. And the interesting thing, that says 2 things to us, the one about sharing. First of all, it says something about how they want to present themselves to their peers. So they're much more associating their teen identity with unhealthy foods. And also those network effects that you achieve in social media are then really created and amplified by teens being more likely to share unhealthy food than healthier foods. Next slide. And finally, we looked at what did they remember. So when we had showed them these different Facebook mock-ups, we didn't tell them that it was a study of advertising. We just told them it was a study about social media, and we were interested to see what they thought about this. So they weren't alert to the ads, so we tried to make it as ecologically valid that way as possible. And we measured free recall and prompted recognition. And as we see in general, so this is how human memory works, that free recall is a much more difficult task than prompted recall, i.e. if you're asked to say, what did you see? That's much more difficult than if you're shown a list of names and said, did you see this or this or this? And I find these findings particularly interesting because what the free recall does is mimic what we tend to do in research studies, where we say to children, have you seen any ads for unhealthy foods? Whereas the prompted recall more mimics the scenario of, say, you're in a shop where you're then exposed to all of these prompts to buy. As you can see, these were all statistically significant differences between the unhealthy food and the healthy food in terms of what children were seeing, what these young teens were seeing in social media. Okay, next slide, please, Andrew. So just to sum up, unhealthy was greater than non-food and greater than healthy for 5 out of the 6 measures listed underneath that. And when we think about what that's doing to how children are attending to what they're looking at, how young people are attending to these things, how they're evaluating their peers and themselves, what they're remembering, we have to ask questions about whether they are actually ignoring these unhealthy food ads, as they always tell us they think they are, and to what extent they have choice to say, no, I'm not interested in that. Okay, and the final slide now. So just to sum up, these findings you know, there are many studies in digital media of children's actual engagement with them, other than a large cluster of AdvoGame studies, which Franz is going to tell you about. But there are certain studies around consumption effects. So whether children or teens are in holiday camps, whether they're looking at YouTube influencer promotions or looking at ads on websites and social media, when we do experiments, what we find is that they eat more after they've been exposed to unhealthy foods compared to non-foods or healthy foods. And that's a completely non-controversial takeaway, because we know that that's the case for TV advertising as well. And that is just how advertising works. So it raises really serious questions about the extent of children's exposure, and particularly because social media allows for them to be targeted and exposed in ways which TV, which is broadcast to everybody, doesn't. And it particularly allows people who are more interested in unhealthy things, like Diane was describing, so being drawn into interest through advertising, are likely to receive more of it through social media as a result of algorithms and how they're designed. So in sum, we know that brands use strategies to target children and adolescents. We know that they look to increase their engagement and virality. We know that food brands and the content reaching or aimed at children are extensively dominated by unhealthy food items. We know that children and adolescents interact with this in digital and social media, and the experimental evidence tells us that this results in eating more food, and particularly eating more unhealthy items. So in sum, we have a whole ecosystem of advertising now that prompts children to engage with, to become advertisers themselves by sharing advertising with their friends, and to be affected by this food advertising. So thank you very much for your time, and I'll hand back to Catherine.